Capitalism is colonial and colonialism is capitalist. In this video, I will talk about these two interrelated phenomena. Hi, I'm back. My name is Noorita Roy Choudhury. I have a PhD in Law and Development. For my credentials and experiences, please check the description of my YouTube channel, Planet Decolonized. So coming to the first part, why is capitalism colonial? In the previous video, I mentioned that economic growth is a central feature of capitalism, in that growth is the heartbeat of capitalism. And for capital to remain capital as such, it needs to constantly grow through processes of extraction, expropriation, and dispossession. So if you read the European origin of the capitalist system, you will come across the enclosure movement that happened in the late 15th century in Britain that resulted in the mass eviction of rural peasants from their means of production. And what are these means of production? Their land and labor. The enclosure movement basically separated people and labor from their commonly owned lands, which were eventually privatized and vested in the hands of few elite landlords, corporations, and the state. So Karl Marx sort of theorized these historical and violent processes of extraction, expropriation, and dispossession within the concept of primitive accumulation by arguing that the process is a precondition to capitalist growth and expansion because it constantly needs to separate people from their means of production. And this is how class formations take place between those who own the means of production and those who don't. There is nothing voluntary about the process of primitive accumulation because for the cycle of growth to keep sustaining itself, it needs to rely on the violent separation of people from their means of production. So ultimately, why capitalism is colonial is because of its imperative of growth that requires continuous processes of primitive accumulation, seeking free or cheap land, labor, resources, and lives that can be extracted, legally stolen, or expropriated, ultimately dispossessing people of their basic living conditions. Now coming to what I understand by colonialism is capitalist. Simply put, the capitalist market system was shoved down the throats of the racialized people through the process of colonization that led to the mass and ongoing dispossession of indigenous, black, and other peasant and marginalized communities from their land, from their culture, leading to the erasure of other ways of understanding markets and also relating to the world. We were first colonized by the British East India Company, which introduced the concept of corporation and codified property laws through the Permanent Settlement Law of 1793. These laws essentially dispossessed indigenous and peasant communities of their rights as original landholders and transferred these rights to local landlords who were a handful few and largely from upper caste or privileged caste backgrounds. This restructuring through law was done to ensure an efficient land revenue system for the British Empire. Even though these laws were abolished after India's formal independence, the unequal ownership structure among the indigenous, peasant, and the landlord communities largely remains unchanged till date. So in sum, what British colonialism did in countries like India was it obliterated local and community-based market systems that relied on values of reciprocity, local production for local consumption, and collective well-being. So ultimately, what I mean by colonialism is capitalist is that its logic of constant economic growth requiring the violent separation of people and labor from basic means of production was imposed through colonial expansion. And capitalism is not a timeless economic system, but rather a recent one that was imposed through colonization. I will end the video by reading an excerpt from the book named Extractive Capitalism: How Commodities and Cronyism Drive the Global Economy by Laleh Khalili. She is an Iranian-American professor based at the University of Exeter. She teaches Gulf Studies. Multinational corporations, which were some of the earliest tools of colonial control, are at the heart of how extractive industries operate. To understand their inner workings, we must peel back their shell companies, their ownership structures, their histories, and their contemporary connections. Modern capitalism has its roots in colonialism. The dispossession of indigenous people in Asia, Africa, and Latin America enabled colonizers to take control of resources and expand international trade. The enslavement and transportation of millions of Africans across oceans and the extraction of resources gave rise to the global capitalist market. In the next video, I will cover aspects of why capitalism is violent. Meanwhile, if you have any constructive feedback, please do so with dignity and care. You will receive the exact amount of dignity you give me. If your comments are dumb, anti-intellectual, racist, sexist, in the form of statements or jokes, I will simply block you or send you for an IQ test. Anyway, that's it. Peace. Bye.